Video final. Scary stories.
Before we begin, please make sure you visit our Video Phantoms website every day and check out all of the new content and cool stuff we have for you over there. Also, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you won't miss whenever we upload next. With that being said, let's grab your popcorn and enjoy the video.
Alice Jenkins always thought her neighborhood was safe. Nestled in a quiet suburb, the streets were clean, the lawns well manicured, and the houses uniform in their pleasantness. She lived alone in a modest two-story house, enjoying the peace and routine of her daily life. That peace was shattered one chilly autumn night when she looked out her window and saw something that made her blood run cold. It was around midnight, and Alice had just finished a chapter of her favorite mystery novel. She placed the book on her nightstand and got up to close the window. The cool night air was soothing, and she took a moment to enjoy the silence. But then, something caught her eye. Across the street, on top of her neighbor's house, stood a man. He was tall, dressed in black, and utterly still. The streetlight illuminated his figure just enough to cast eerie shadows, making him look even more menacing. Alice blinked, thinking her eyes were playing tricks on her, but the man was still there, unmoving. Her neighbor, Mrs. Wilson, was an elderly widow who lived alone. The thought of someone lurking on her roof in the dead of night filled Alice with dread. She grabbed her phone and dialed Mrs. Wilson's number, but there was no answer. Panic set in. Should she call the police? But what would she say? That there was a man standing on her neighbor's roof? It sounded absurd. Alice decided to keep watch. She turned off her lights to avoid being seen and peered through a gap in the curtains. The man remained motionless, like a statue. Minutes felt like hours as she watched, her mind racing with fear and speculation. Who was he? What was he doing there? And why wasn't he moving? Suddenly, the man shifted. He turned his head slowly, almost mechanically, and looked directly at Alice's window. Her heart skipped a beat. She ducked down instinctively, her breath coming in shallow gasps. After a few moments, she mustered the courage to peek out again. The man was gone. Alice felt a chill run down her spine. She scanned the area, but there was no sign of him. Had he jumped down? Was he hiding somewhere? She considered going outside to check on Mrs. Wilson, but fear kept her rooted in place. Instead, she kept vigil by her window, hoping the strange man wouldn't return. The next morning, Alice felt exhausted. She had barely slept, her mind replaying the bizarre encounter over and over. She decided to check on Mrs. Wilson. Maybe the old woman had seen something or could offer some explanation. Alice crossed the street and knocked on Mrs. Wilson's door. It took a few moments before the door creaked open, revealing the elderly woman. Her eyes were tired but kind. "Alice, dear, what brings you here so early?" Mrs. Wilson asked. "Good morning, Mrs. Wilson. I saw something strange last night," Alice began, feeling awkward about her concern. "Oh, what did you see?" Mrs. Wilson's expression turned serious. "There was a man standing on your roof around midnight. I tried calling you, but you didn't answer." Mrs. Wilson looked puzzled. "A man on my roof? Are you sure, dear?" "I'm certain. He was just standing there, watching." Mrs. Wilson shook her head. "I didn't hear anything. I'm a light sleeper, too." "Are you sure it wasn't a shadow or something?" Alice felt a pang of doubt but stood firm. "I'm sure. Please be careful, Mrs. Wilson." The old woman patted her arm reassuringly. "Thank you, Alice. I'll keep an eye out. But don't worry too much. It was probably nothing." Alice returned home, feeling uneasy. As the day went on, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. That night, she found herself glancing out the window repeatedly, half expecting to see the mysterious figure again. As the clock struck midnight, Alice's heart began to race. She forced herself to look outside. Her street was empty, and the rooftops were bare. She let out a sigh of relief and turned away, only to be startled by a loud knock at her door. Her heart pounded as she approached the door cautiously. "Who is it?" she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. No answer. She peeked through the peephole, but saw nothing. Another knock, more insistent this time. Gathering her courage, she slowly opened the door. No one was there. She stepped outside and looked around, but the street was deserted. She closed the door quickly, locking it behind her. The sense of being watched was overwhelming. She decided to call the police. 2 officers arrived shortly after her call. She explained what she had seen and heard. and they did a thorough check of her property and the surrounding area. They found no signs of anyone having been there. "Ma'am, it could have been a prank," one of the officers suggested. "Kids sometimes do things like this to scare people." Alice nodded, though she wasn't convinced. After the officers left, she double-checked all her locks and windows before heading to bed, but sleep eluded her. The following day, she noticed Mrs. Wilson wasn't outside tending to her garden as usual. Concerned, Alice went over to check on her. She knocked several times but got no response. Her worry intensified, and she called out, "Mrs. Wilson, are you all right?" Still no answer. She tried the door, and to her surprise, it was unlocked. She entered cautiously, calling out again. The house was eerily silent. As she ventured further in, she found Mrs. Wilson lying on the floor in the living room, unconscious. Alice rushed to her side and called an ambulance. Mrs. Wilson was taken to the hospital, and Alice learned from the doctors that she had suffered a mild heart attack. They said she would recover, but she needed rest and care. Relieved that her neighbor would be all right, Alice couldn't help but wonder if the incident with the man on the roof had anything to do with this. She shared her concerns with the doctors, but they couldn't find any connection. That night, Alice returned home, feeling more isolated than ever. She tried to distract herself with TV, but her mind kept drifting back to the strange man in Mrs. Wilson's condition. She decided to do some research, hoping to find any similar incidents in the area. Hours passed as she combed through online forums and news articles. She found nothing recent, but came across an old story from several decades ago about a man who had been seen standing on rooftops in the neighborhood. According to the article, the sightings had stopped abruptly after a few months, and the man was never identified. Alice felt a chill. Could it be the same person, or someone emulating him? She printed the article and decided to show it to Mrs. Wilson when she visited her in the hospital the next day. Mrs. Wilson was sitting up in bed, looking much better, when Alice arrived. "I'm so glad you're okay," Alice said, handing her the article. "I found this last night. Do you think it could be related?" Mrs. Wilson read the article carefully, her expression growing more serious. "I remember hearing about this when I was younger. My parents used to tell me to stay away from the windows at night because of the rooftop watcher." "The rooftop watcher," Alice repeated. "Yes, that's what they called him. It was a local legend. People said he would appear on rooftops and just watch. No one knew why or what he wanted. And then, one day, he just vanished." Alice felt a shiver run down her spine. "What if he's back?" Mrs. Wilson sighed. "I don't know, dear, but if he is, we need to be careful." Alice left the hospital with a sense of foreboding. She couldn't shake the feeling that the rooftop watcher was real and that he had returned. That night, she made sure every door and window was locked, and she kept a light on in every room. As the clock neared midnight, Alice's nerves were on edge. She sat by her window, watching and waiting. At exactly 12, she saw movement out of the corner of her eye. Her heart pounded as she turned to look. The man was back. He stood on Mrs. Wilson's roof, his silhouette dark against the night sky. Alice felt a surge of anger mixed with fear. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, keeping her eyes on the figure. "There's a man on my neighbor's roof," she told the dispatcher. "Please hurry." The dispatcher assured her that officers were on their way. Alice watched as the man slowly turned his head to look at her. It was as if he knew she was watching, as if he could see her through the darkness. She felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. Minutes later, she heard sirens approaching. The man didn't move. The police arrived and searched the area, but by the time they reached Mrs. Wilson's house, the man had vanished again. The officers found no trace of him. Alice felt a mix of frustration and fear. The police believed her but were unable to find any evidence. They promised to patrol the area more frequently, but it did little to ease her anxiety. The next few nights were eerily quiet. Alice continued her nightly vigil, but the man did not reappear. She began to hope that maybe he was gone for good. Mrs. Wilson returned home from the hospital, and life started to feel a bit more normal. But one night, as Alice was getting ready for bed, she heard a noise outside. It sounded like footsteps on her roof. Her heart raced as she grabbed her phone and ran to the window. She couldn't see anything in the darkness, but the sound persisted. She called the police again, her voice trembling. "I think he's on my roof this time," she said. The dispatcher stayed on the line with her until the officers arrived. They searched her property thoroughly, but found no one. Alice felt like she was losing her mind. How could someone disappear so quickly and completely? Desperate for answers, she decided to visit the local library the next day. She asked the librarian for any records or stories about the rooftop watcher. The librarian, an elderly woman named Margaret, looked surprised. Not many people ask about that old tale, Margaret said, leading Alice to a dusty corner of the library. But we do have some information. Alice spent hours poring over old newspapers and local history books. She discovered that the rooftop watcher had first appeared in the 1950s. There were numerous reports of sightings, all eerily similar to her own experience. The man would stand on rooftops, watching silently. No one knew who he was or what he wanted. And then, as suddenly as the sightings began, they stopped. One article mentioned a local man, Samuel Hayes, who had been suspected of being the watcher. He was known for his strange behavior and had a fascination with rooftops. But before the police could question him, he disappeared, leaving behind a trail of mystery. Alice left the library with more questions than answers. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something supernatural about the watcher. Why else would he reappear after all these years? That night, she decided to confront her fear head-on. She armed herself with a flashlight and a baseball bat, determined to catch the watcher if he appeared again. As midnight approached, she took her position by the window, watching and waiting. The minutes ticked by slowly. Alice's grip on the bat tightened. Then, just as the clock struck 12, she saw him. The watcher was standing on her roof, his dark figure barely visible against the night sky. Alice's heart pounded as she crept towards the attic. She opened the hatch silently and climbed up, her flashlight in one hand and the bat in the other. She could hear the faint sound of footsteps above her. Summoning all her courage, she pushed open the small window that led to the roof. She climbed out cautiously, her eyes scanning the area. The watcher stood at the edge, his back to her. She felt a surge of anger and fear. "Who are you?" she shouted. "What do you want?" The watcher turned slowly to face her. For the first time, Alice could see his face. It was pale, almost ghostly, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through her. He didn't say a word, just stared at her with an intensity that made her shiver. Alice took a step forward, raising the bat. "Leave us alone," she demanded. The watcher tilted his head slightly, as if considering her words. Then, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, he said, "I watch because I must." Before Alice could respond, he stepped off the edge of the roof. She rushed forward, expecting to see him lying on the ground below, but there was nothing. He had vanished into thin air. Alice climbed back inside, trembling. She locked the attic window and sat down, her mind racing. What did he mean by "I watch because I must"? She knew she needed help, someone who could understand what was happening. The next day, she visited a local historian named Richard Harris, who had written several books about the town's history and legends. She told him everything, from the sightings to the old articles she had found. Richard listened intently, nodding thoughtfully. "The rooftop watcher is one of our town's oldest legends," he said. "Some believe he's a ghost, others think he's a guardian of some sort, but no one knows for sure." "Why does he watch?" Alice asked. Richard shrugged. "Your guess is as good as mine. But there are theories. Some say he's looking for something or someone. Others believe he's cursed to watch over the town for eternity." Alice felt a chill. "What should I do?" Richard leaned back in his chair, considering her question. "You've confronted him, which is more than most people have done. I think the best course of action is to protect yourself. Keep your doors and windows locked, and don't engage with him if you see him again. Sometimes these things fade away if you don't give them attention." Alice nodded, feeling a bit more reassured. She thanked Richard and left, determined to follow his advice. That night, she prepared herself for another encounter. She kept her lights on, her doors locked, and her phone within reach. Midnight came and went without any sign of the watcher. Alice began to hope that maybe Richard was right, that ignoring the watcher would make him go away. Several nights passed peacefully. Alice started to relax, believing that the nightmare was finally over. But one night, as she was drifting off to sleep, she heard a familiar sound, footsteps on the roof. Her heart sank. She grabbed her phone and called the police, her hands shaking. As she waited for them to arrive, she listened to the footsteps, feeling more helpless than ever. The police arrived quickly and searched the area again, but as before, they found nothing. Alice felt a crushing sense of defeat. What if the watcher never went away? What if he continued to haunt her? Determined to find a solution, Alice reached out to a local paranormal investigator named Dee. Determined to find a solution, Alice reached out to a local paranormal investigator named Dr. Emily Carter. She had heard about Dr. Carter through an online forum and hoped she could provide some answers. Dr. Carter agreed to visit Alice's home the next day. She arrived with a team of investigators and equipment designed to detect supernatural activity. They spent hours examining the house, the roof, and the surrounding area. Finally, Dr. Carter sat down with Alice. "There's definitely something unusual here," she said. "We picked up some strange readings on the roof. It's possible that the rooftop watcher is a spirit trapped between worlds." Alice listened intently. "How do we get rid of him?" Dr. Carter smiled reassuringly. "We'll perform a cleansing ritual. It might help to release the spirit and put him to rest. But you need to be prepared for the possibility that it might not work immediately. These things can take time." Alice agreed to the ritual, desperate for any solution. That night, Dr. Carter and her team set up candles, incense, and other tools around the house. They chanted and performed the ritual, filling the air with a sense of calm and hope. As the ritual concluded, Alice felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She thanked Dr. Carter and her team, feeling more hopeful than she had in weeks. The next few nights were quiet. There were no footsteps, no strange sightings. Alice began to believe that the ritual had worked, that the watcher was finally gone. But on the fifth night, she woke to a sound that made her heart stop, a soft tapping on her window. She sat up, her pulse racing. The tapping continued, rhythmic and persistent. She forced herself to look towards the window, half expecting to see the watcher's pale face staring back at her. Instead, she saw a small figure, almost childlike, tapping on the glass. Alice got up slowly, her mind racing. She approached the window cautiously and peered out. It was a little boy, no more than 7 or 8 years old, dressed in old-fashioned clothes. His eyes were wide with fear, and he looked lost. She opened the window slightly. "Who are you?" she asked softly. The boy looked up at her with tear-filled eyes. "I'm lost," he whispered. "Can you help me find my way home?" Alice felt a surge of sympathy. She opened the window wider and reached out to the boy. "Where's your home?" she asked. The boy pointed towards the old, abandoned house at the end of the street. Alice hesitated. The house had been empty for years, rumored to be haunted, but she couldn't leave the boy out in the cold. "Okay, I'll help you," she said, climbing out of the window. She took the boy's hand, and they walked towards the old house together. As they approached, the boy stopped and looked up at her. "Thank you," he said softly. "You're the first person who's ever seen me." Alice felt a chill. "What do you mean?" The boy smiled sadly. "I've been lost for a long time. The watcher tried to help me, but he couldn't. Maybe now I can find peace." Before Alice could respond, the boy faded away, leaving her standing alone in front of the old house. She felt a strange sense of closure, as if a chapter had finally ended. The next morning, Alice woke up feeling lighter than she had in months. She knew the watcher might still be out there, but she also knew she had helped someone find peace, and that gave her the strength to face whatever came next.
Hey, what's up, guys? This your boy Quan318. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please like this video and subscribe to my channel. It really helps me to grow. And guys, if you really enjoyed the video, please give it a share on social media, Facebook, Twitter, wherever you guys be hanging out at the most. It really helps, and I appreciate it, guys. Also, my goal is to reach at least 1 million loyal subscribers over the next 5 years. Guys, I'm going to give it everything I got and go hard as I can. Hopefully it pays off for me, guys. And y'all going to be a big part of that. And as I grow, you guys will be rewarded for a lot of stuff for helping me participating. And as just a token of my appreciation, guys, the least I can do. Also, guys, make sure you go down in the video description and click the links. Visit all my websites. I done put hella work into these websites, man. Getting them built up, jam-packed with content just for you guys. You know, we got videos. We got the hottest trending offers online. I'm talking about everything, guys. Everything from education, teaching you how to make $1,000 a day online. Like, man, guys, everything that you can think of is on there. So, guys, make sure you go over there, check it out. Click links, watch videos, do your thing, man. I really want you guys to enjoy. I worked hard on it, and I want you guys to really enjoy it, man. So, yeah. Also, guys, while you're down there in the description, make sure you go and check out my other channels. I got links to all of them down below. I worked hard on these channels, guys. I worked hard on my websites. I worked hard on everything for you guys. Make sure you join my Facebook groups. I got Facebook groups set up for every channel that I got, guys. I'm trying to go global, man. You feel me? It's the family, man. This Rich Fannos, man. I want y'all to be part of Rich Fannos. Y'all part of the family, man. This a mafia, you feel me? Going worldwide with this shit. But anyway, man, love you guys. Y'all be blessed, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.